The message lodged itself in my mind the way a shard of glass does in skin, invisible at first and then impossible to ignore once you feel the burn. It had arrived by accident, a wrong vibration on a phone that wasn't meant for me, and yet every word seemed to know my name even though it never used it. It spoke of weeks instead of months, of an illness that would finish the job, of money measured in sums so large they stopped feeling real, and of a future that would only begin once an inconvenient woman was no longer breathing. I remember standing in my kitchen in the pale light before dawn, the kettle screaming itself dry on the stove, rereading the lines until the letters blurred and reassembled into something even uglier than before. My daughter, Elena, was lying in a hospice room across town, her body already giving up piece by piece, and the man who had promised to love her was counting down the calendar like a child waiting for summer vacation. The sender's name was a stranger's, but the tone was unmistakable, casual and intimate, the voice of someone who thought he was safe because no one was supposed to be listening. I didn't scream or throw the phone or do anything dramatic. I just sat down and felt the room tilt as if the house itself had shifted on its foundations. In that quiet, I realized grief had already changed shape, hardening into something colder and more focused, something that didn't just mourn but remembered. By the time the hospice called later that morning to tell me Elena had died at 6:42, I had already said goodbye to the version of the world where I believed betrayal was always loud and obvious. Sometimes it arrived softly, in tidy sentences, dressed up as plans. I drove through a city that was just beginning to wake, a place of low clouds and glass towers, where early buses hissed at empty stops and bakery lights glowed like small promises against the gray. The nurse's voice had been gentle, practiced, the way voices become when they carry bad news for a living, and she told me Elena's husband had been there, that he was taking care of things, that it might be better if I came later in the day. I remember thinking how strange it was that anyone could decide what was better for a mother who had just lost her only child. When I reached the hospice, the parking lot already felt scrubbed of her, as if even the asphalt had moved on. Her room was bare, the bed made with hospital corners, the window open just enough to let in the smell of rain. The quilt I had brought from home, the photos taped to the wall, the notebooks where she still tried to sketch when her hands were steady enough, gone. It was like walking into a room that had been reset for a different life. My phone buzzed with a message that contained nothing but instructions. A date, a time, an address, no condolences, no acknowledgement that the axis of my world had snapped. When I tried to call, the call slid straight into silence. I drove to the house she had designed herself, a sharp-lined place of light and shadow overlooking a bend in the river, and found the gate closed, the code changed, the voice on the intercom distant and final. He told me it wasn't a good time, told me to wait, told me we would talk later, and then he cut the connection as if trimming a thread. Sitting there, staring at metal bars where my daughter's welcome used to be automatic, I felt the first clear certainty settle in my chest. This wasn't just grief rearranging people into strangers. Something had been planned, and I was standing in the middle of it without a map. The days before the funeral passed like a badly edited film, scenes stitched together without logic. Strangers sending flowers, neighbors bringing food I couldn't taste. The same memory of Elena at different ages looping in my head like a song stuck on repeat. At the service, the room was full of people who knew her work but not her childhood, who could talk about awards and buildings but not about the way she used to line up her shoes by color when she was 10. Her husband stood at the front and performed sorrow with a precision that would have impressed me if I hadn't seen the version of him that never visited when the pain was worst, the version that always had somewhere else to be. When he spoke, he used words she never used, phrases that sounded like they had been borrowed from someone else's story. And when the tears vanished the moment he turned away from the crowd, I understood how easy it was for some people to step in and out of roles. Afterward, in a room that smelled of coffee and damp coats, one of Elena's closest friends pulled me aside and told me, in a voice that kept breaking, that my daughter had been preparing to leave him, that she had found something wrong in the accounts and something worse in his lies. She had been collecting proof quietly because she was afraid he would erase it if he knew. That night, when his lawyer called to say the will would be read the next evening at the house, I heard again the calm confidence in that message I shouldn't have seen, and I understood that whatever was coming next would not be simple, and it would not be kind. The house felt different with the lights all on, as if someone had tried to bleach the shadows out of it and failed. Cars lined the curved drive, vehicles that spoke of money and confidence, the kind of confidence that assumes rooms will always make space for you. Inside, the air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and something metallic, and the walls still held the quiet hum of the life my daughter had designed into them. A man in a dark suit I recognized as our longtime family solicitor, Thomas Reed, stood near the desk Elena used as a home office, shuffling papers with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who knows every eye is watching him. Her husband, Victor, didn't bother with greetings. He nodded once, the way you acknowledge a clerk who has already done their job, and told me to sit wherever I liked. There were others there too, people I only knew by reputation, two senior partners from the firm, a woman from the finance department, and a younger woman who kept her gaze fixed on the floor as if it might open and swallow her. When Thomas began to read, his voice was steady, but I noticed the way he paused before looking directly at Victor, as if bracing himself against a sudden gust of wind. He said plainly that Victor was not named as a beneficiary. The word "not" seemed to hang in the air longer than the rest of the sentence. Victor laughed, a short, brittle sound that cracked in the middle, and started talking about marriage and shared property and how none of this made sense. But Thomas continued, explaining that Elena had filed for divorce weeks before her death, that the documents were recorded, that notices had been sent. Victor's face went through a series of colors that reminded me of old photographs left too long in the sun. When my name was read, when the words "entire estate" and "held in trust" and "foundation" followed one another in careful legal sequence, I felt as if the room had shifted again, not tilting this time but opening, revealing a space I hadn't known existed, one that had been prepared for me without my knowledge. He didn't stay for the rest. He said something about fraud, about manipulation, about how this would be tied up in court until everyone forgot why it started, and then he left, the door closing behind him with a sound that was more final than dramatic. The others remained, quiet and uncertain, until Thomas explained that Elena had wanted the firm to continue, that she had planned for a transition, that she believed work could outlive people if it was cared for properly. When they were gone, when the house had settled back into its own echo, Thomas showed me the folder Elena had brought him weeks earlier, thin but heavy with implication. Inside were copies of filings, notes in her precise handwriting, and a list of things she said were in a private safe at her office. She had been afraid, he told me, not of dying, but of leaving a mess that someone else would profit from. The next morning, we went to the building she had converted from an old shipping warehouse, a place of brick and light where drafts of the future had once been taped to every available surface. The safe was hidden behind a framed sketch, the kind of detail only someone who loved secrets would bother with, and when it was finally opened under court supervision, the story she hadn't had time to finish telling unfolded in careful, damning order. Statements showing millions moved in neat increments to accounts that didn't belong to the firm, photographs that were too intimate to explain away, and messages that spoke about time as if it were a resource to be spent, about patience as if it were something owed. One name kept appearing in those messages, a woman who had worked in Victor's office and had vanished days after Elena died, and when she finally reappeared through an attorney, she looked smaller than she had in the photographs, as if guilt had a way of compressing people. She said she hadn't known how sick Elena was at first, that she had been told a story about a marriage already over, that she believed she was waiting for paperwork instead of a funeral. When she realized the truth, she tried to leave, and when she did, Victor told her it would be kinder to stay quiet, to let things end naturally, to not make waves in the last stretch. There are lies that depend on your decency to survive, and she had fallen into one of them. The hearing that followed was supposed to be a formality, but when our attorney laid out the evidence, when the judge read the messages about weeks and money and inconvenience, the room grew very still. Victor tried to talk his way around it, but there are some sentences that cannot be rearranged into innocence. By the time his lawyer asked for a recess, the outcome was already leaning in a direction he could not push back. He withdrew the challenge before the day was over, agreed to return what he had taken, agreed to disappear from the life he had assumed he would inherit, and walked out without looking at me, as if eye contact might make the whole thing more real. When the papers were signed and the doors closed behind him, the silence felt earned rather than empty. I sat with Thomas in the wide living room while evening pressed its gray face against the windows, and for the first time since Elena's death, I allowed myself to feel something close to exhaustion instead of fury. There is a particular tiredness that comes from standing upright for too long in the middle of other people's storms, a fatigue that doesn't ask for sleep so much as permission to stop bracing. Thomas talked about timelines, about trusteeship and oversight and the kind of practical scaffolding that grief always seems to require. But my mind kept drifting to the way Elena used to walk through this house, barefoot, tracing invisible lines in the air as she explained why a wall had to be exactly where it was. In the days that followed, I went to her office more often than I went home, learning the geography of her absence by heart. The staff were polite in that careful way people are when they don't know whether to treat you as an authority or a wound, and I told them the only honest thing I could, that I didn't know how to do their jobs, but I knew why their work mattered to her, and that would have to be enough for a while. We appointed a managing director from among them, someone who had argued with her about materials and budgets, and one often enough to be trusted. And we set up a board that looked like a cross-section of the firm she had built, not a reflection of the man who had almost dismantled it. The first time I signed a document as trustee, my hand shook, not because I was afraid of the responsibility, but because I could feel how close it had come to being signed by someone who would have sold everything for speed. The foundation took longer. There are forms for everything, and every form seems to want proof that you are who you say you are and that the dead are really dead, and each request felt like being asked, again and again, to confirm something I would have given anything to deny. But piece by piece, it came together. A mission statement that sounded like Elena's voice, criteria that favored persistence over polish, a small endowment that would grow instead of vanish into a headline. On what would have been her 42nd birthday, we held a modest ceremony in the lobby of a building she had once described as a conversation between glass and gravity. Former clients came, students came, people who had only known her work came, and I stood where she would have stood and tried to speak without letting the words turn into a eulogy. I talked about rooms that make space for people instead of shrinking them, about cities that remember who they are because someone cared enough to argue with concrete, and about the way legacies are not monuments so much as habits we choose to keep. When the first grants were announced, when 3 young women walked up to accept something that would change the shape of their next few years, I felt a small, fierce certainty settle in me, the kind that doesn't erase loss but gives it somewhere to live without poisoning everything around it. I still go to the cemetery on Sundays. The hill looks different depending on the season, sometimes sharp with wind, sometimes soft with early light, and the skyline beyond it keeps rearranging itself the way cities do when they're alive. Her stone is simple, because she hated things that tried too hard to impress, and I bring whatever flowers are in season, because she believed in using what was actually there. I tell her about the firm, about arguments over designs she would have enjoyed, about a student who sent a letter saying she finally believed she belonged in a field that had never quite believed in her. I don't tell her about Victor anymore. That story is finished, and it doesn't deserve the air. When I leave, I drive past buildings she touched and buildings she never did, and I think about how easy it is to underestimate quiet people, to confuse patience with weakness, to assume that age is a kind of closing instead of a widening. Grief taught me many things I didn't ask to learn, but it also taught me that protection is a form of creation, and that sometimes the last thing you build for someone you love is a future they don't get to see. In the weeks that followed, the city began to treat Elena's absence like a gap it had to step around rather than a wound it needed to examine, and I understood why people do that. It is easier to reroute than to rebuild. The firm found its rhythm again, not the same rhythm, but one that moved forward instead of in circles, and I learned to read financial statements the way I once read essays, looking not just for mistakes but for intention. Every so often, a reporter would call, hopping for a clean story about scandal and redemption and neat endings, and every so often I would say no, because my daughter's life was not a parable and her death was not a lesson anyone else was entitled to. What I did say yes to were meetings with students who wanted to talk about how she had started, about how she had failed early and often and kept going anyway, and those conversations felt more honest than any article ever could. One afternoon, while walking through the drafting room, I noticed a sketch pinned to a board that wasn't in her style at all soft curves and improbable shadows, and when I asked about it, a young architect told me it was for a community center in a neighborhood that never seemed to get anything new. Elena had approved the concept days before she died, had written a note in the margin that said simply, "Make it generous." The word stayed with me, not because it was grand, but because it was exact. Generosity, I realized, was the only reasonable response to the kind of narrowing that grief tries to impose. There were legal echoes, of course. Money has a way of dragging its feet even when everyone agrees where it's supposed to go, and the accounts Victor had touched took months to fully unwind, each transaction like a small knot that had to be picked apart by patient hands. Once, his lawyer sent a letter that tried to reopen a door that had already been bricked over, and Thomas answered it with a document so precise it felt like a map drawn to scale, and that was the end of it. I didn't celebrate. I don't think closure is a bell you ring so much as a shelf you finally stop rearranging. Instead, I put my energy into the unglamorous work of making sure the foundation did what it said it would do, into reading applications that were equal parts ambition and doubt, into remembering how much courage it takes to ask for help in a field that teaches you to pretend you don't need any. Some evenings, I would sit at my kitchen table with a stack of proposals and a pencil, and think about how strange it was that a life could be reduced to paper, and then expanded again by what people chose to build with it. One rainy morning, a box arrived at my door with no return address, just my name in careful block letters. Inside were notebooks I recognized immediately, the ones Elena had used to write down ideas that didn't yet deserve a screen or a scale, pages full of half-formed questions and small, stubborn hopes. There was a note from a former assistant who had found them while clearing an old storage room and couldn't bear to throw them away. I spent the afternoon reading, not because I was looking for instructions, but because I wanted to hear her thinking again, the way she argued with herself on paper, the way she circled back to problems she refused to let go. One page had a list of things she wanted to learn if there's time, and I laughed out loud at that, a sound that surprised me with its own steadiness. Time, I thought, is not something you get. It's something you use, and sometimes it's something you leave behind for other people to spend more wisely. I put the notebooks on a shelf near my desk, not as relics, but as reminders that the work is always unfinished, and that unfinished does not mean unworthy. Spring arrived in hesitant increments, the kind that pretend to be generous and then retreat into cold rain without apology, and with it came a strange, quiet pressure to decide what my days were for now that they were no longer organized around hospital visits or legal deadlines. I kept a small office at the firm, not because anyone needed me there, but because I liked the way the building sounded when it was working, the layered hush of people thinking and the sudden, bright arguments of ideas finding their shape. Sometimes I would sit in Elena's old chair, not as an act of nostalgia, but as a practical experiment, trying to see the room from the angle she had chosen, trying to understand what she had been looking at when she decided a line needed to move or a window needed to open. I began to recognize the patterns in the staff, who stayed late and who left exactly on time, who argued because they cared and who argued because they were afraid. And it reminded me of classrooms, of the way you learn more from how people hesitate than from how they speak. The Foundation's first annual report came in a thick envelope that felt heavier than it was, full of numbers and stories and photographs of projects that hadn't existed a year earlier. And I realized that this, too, was a kind of architecture, not of steel and glass, but of chances given and taken. On an afternoon when the light came in low and gold, I walked through a nearly finished library in a neighborhood that used to be described only by what it lacked, and I watched children press their hands against the windows, as if testing whether the building was real. And I thought about how Elena would have loved the way the entrance ramp curved like an invitation, rather than a concession. There are still moments when the old anger tries to find its way back in, usually in small, inconvenient places, like when a stranger uses my daughter's name as a shorthand for success without knowing anything about the nights she slept on her office couch, or when I catch a headline that tries to compress a complicated story into something tidy and clickable. When that happens, I go for long walks along the water and let the city remind me that nothing worth keeping stays simple for very long. I think about the way Victor once assumed that time and money would solve everything for him, and how thoroughly he misunderstood both. Time, I've learned, is not a countdown or a promise. It's a medium like light that changes what it touches without asking permission. Money, when it's stripped of its noise, is just another tool, as capable of harm as it is of shelter. The only thing that has stayed consistently reliable is work done with care, and the quiet, stubborn decision to keep doing it even when the reason you started has changed shape. Some evenings, I sit at my own kitchen table with a cup of tea and write letters I never send, telling Elena about a student who finally found her voice, or a building that looks better in rain than in sun, or a day that was ordinary in the best possible way, and I don't feel like I'm talking into silence. I feel like I'm adding one more room to a house that is still, somehow, still being built.